Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're firing up the time machine and heading straight into the bustling mill village of East Killingley, Connecticut. The year? 1874. And our anchor point for this whole fascinating journey is going to be the Henry White family. By getting a really close look at their daily lives, the struggles they faced and the community they built, we're going to uncover some absolutely incredible truths about American history. Okay, let's dive into this. What can one ordinary family in 1874 actually tell us about a nation in massive transition? Well, it's a great question, isn't it? Because normally we look at history from the top down. We focus on presidents, wars, the giant economic shifts. But by zooming in on the everyday lived experiences of a single household, like the Whites, we get this visceral micro-history perspective on these massive macro-historical changes. We aren't just reading about the history anymore, we're literally feeling it. To make sense of all this, here is our roadmap for today. First, a blended family's resilience. Second, industry in the 1873 panic. Third, the struggle for schooling. Fourth, changing times in East Killingley. And finally, leisure, loss, and looking forward. Let's start with Section 1, a blended family's resilience. We are starting our journey right inside the emotional walls of the White House. Because honestly, you really cannot understand this era without grasping the sheer grit it took just to keep a family together. 5. Think about that number for a second. That represents the 5 children left behind when Henry's first wife, Amy, tragically passed away in 1864. Overnight, Henry was a widower, raising kids ranging from 5 all the way to 19 years old. The immediate domestic burden was just immense. They had to lean heavily on their extended kinship networks and their local Baptist congregation just to survive those first couple of years. And the decade that followed, an absolute whirlwind. In 1864, as Henry's first wife passed away, his future second wife, Almira, was facing her own tragedy. Her first husband died at just 20 years old. 2 years later, in 1866, Henry and the widowed Almira get married. But the heartbreak wasn't over for them. In 1873, they lost an infant son on the exact day he was born. Yet, somehow, out of that profound grief, comes renewal with the birth of their daughter Effie in December 1874. This rapid-fire succession of deep grief, blending a family, and then finding renewal all within a single decade, it's astonishing. By 1874, the household was this genuinely blended family navigating profound loss and new life. We tend to think of the blended family as this strictly modern concept, right? But the reality is, 19th century families were constantly reforming because of high mortality rates. Almira brought her son George into the mix, Henry still had his teenage son Frederick at home, and together they were navigating incredibly complex emotional terrain. Almira's emotional resilience in holding this blended unit together, all while preparing for a new baby, is just truly remarkable. Which brings us to Section 2, Industry and the 1873 Panic. Let's step outside the family home and into the workplace. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Henry's career maps perfectly onto the broader Industrial Revolution. Back in 1850, he was an independent weaver. By 1860, he's actually a manufacturer with some real authority. But zoom ahead to 1870, and he's a mill operative, just a wage worker. And by 1880, he shifts entirely to carpentry. We are literally watching his demotion from an independent artisan to a factory wage worker, totally displaced by large-scale production. He had to completely reinvent his livelihood just to get by. So why was his world so unstable? 2 words, the Panic of 1873. This was a severe financial crisis that triggered a prolonged, brutal economic depression. For those New England textile mills, it meant reduced demand, devastating wage cuts, and terrifying layoffs. If Henry was still in the cotton mill in 1874, his family would have been drowning in economic anxiety. This depression was the absolute direct cause of the unstable wages gripping these communities. And here's the thing, when the primary breadwinner's wages fall, the burden violently shifts back into the home. Almira is managing 2 adolescent boys, she's heavily pregnant, and on top of that, she's taking on supplemental income strategies. We're talking sewing, doing exhausting, back-breaking laundry, or managing boarders. She shouldered a massive physical burden at home to supplement that Milltown income during the Depression. Economic survival was, for sure, a full family endeavor. Moving on to Section 3, the struggle for schooling. Let's expand our scope to the local institutions. Now, Connecticut actually had an advanced, graded school system and early compulsory education laws on the books, but the reality of the 1870s painted a much harsher picture. Working-class families hit hard by the Depression faced an agonizing choice. Do you keep your 14-year-old in school, or do you pull him out for millwork or an apprenticeship just so the family can afford to eat? Since enforcement of these school laws was pretty inconsistent, the whites had to constantly weigh their children's educational advancement against immediate daily economic necessity. That takes us to Section 4, Changing Times in East Killingly. Let's zoom out a bit further. The entire community of East Killingly was undergoing a massive transformation. The Baptist Church was still their anchor, but now it was acting as a hub for the rising temperance movement, which was huge because it gave women like Elmira new avenues for social engagement and moral authority. Plus, a massive influx of Irish and French Canadian immigrants was arriving to seek millwork. The crucial takeaway here is how incredibly fast this community was diversifying. It was shifting from a quiet, Yankee Protestant farming town into a bustling, immigrant-rich industrial center right before their eyes. As a result, East Killingly was becoming, and I quote, less purely agricultural than Henry's boyhood experience, more shaped by factory bells, shift schedules, and the shared rhythms of industrial labor. Can't you just hear that? The harsh ringing bells calling everyone to their shift, the constant vibrating hum of the textile mills. Their whole concept of time completely shifted from the natural agricultural seasons to the strict, shared discipline of the factory clock. Finally, Section 5, Leisure, Loss, and Looking Forward. Let's talk about how this community entertained itself. Let's move to and see how this builds, because their social engagement was remarkably layered. In Step 1, you had men navigating heavy Reconstruction-era news, discussing political turmoil and the lingering aftermath of the Civil War. Step 2 was much more local. They engage in community bereavement rituals, relying heavily on vital mutual aid networks to survive personal losses. But then, Step 3, they were also looking forward. They were anticipating America's upcoming 1876 centennial, planning civic celebrations that brought a real sense of pride and future optimism to an otherwise tough economic period. And despite the crushing economic depression and personal loss, families still found simple, affordable ways to find joy. They read circulating story papers and almanacs, visited the Windham County agricultural fairs to celebrate their rural roots, and enjoyed occasional traveling entertainments. It just goes to show that even in the absolutely toughest of times, the human spirit's desire for connection, storytelling, and simple joy remains completely unbroken. Which brings us to our final provocative thought. How does the story of one ordinary family help us understand the birth of modern America? The White family's incredible resilience perfectly mirrors a nation that was industrializing, modernizing, and navigating some incredibly deep economic and social growing pains. In a way, they are the human face of the Industrial Revolution. I'd highly encourage you to look into your own family genealogy with this new perspective. What macro-historical shifts were your ancestors surviving in their everyday lives? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep staying curious.